Have you ever wondered how a translation happens? Let's start with a simple question. What is translation? In basic terms, translation is the process of changing words from one language into the words in another language that have a similar meaning. Literary translation, which we'll be focusing on, is the translation from one language into the other of a form of literature such as poetry, prose, drama, or songs. But let's be more specific. Translation is an interpretive process through which a source text, also known as the original, is translated into a target text, also known as the translation. In this process, a translator takes a source text in a source language, interprets it, and recreates it in a target text in a target language. Here's an example. Say a translator is translating a poem from Chinese into English. The poem would be considered the source text. Chinese would be the source language, English would be the target language, and the translation would be the target text. Sounds simple, right? Not exactly.
One does not simply translate poetry.
Languages are incredibly complex systems, which pose unique challenges to translators tasked with trying to find words and phrases of similar meaning in other languages. As the poet and translator Anne Carson notes, languages aren't sciences of one another, meaning what is conveyed in one language often can't be perfectly carried over to another, because the cultural context attached to words in one language can be drastically different from those of another language. So how do translators do it? What are some techniques translators use to translate works of literature? Saint Jerome, a 4th century theologian and translator, distinguished between two different approaches for translation, word for word and sense for sense. According to Jerome, word-for-word translation strictly follows the word order and wording of the source text, where sense-for-sense translation is freer, focusing on the sense or meaning of each translated sentence or phrase, not just individual words. Debates over the merits of free translation, sense for sense, or literal translation, word for word, persist to this day, with translators and critics often evaluating translations based on these qualities. In the 17th century, the English author John Dryden popularized the terms metaphrase and paraphrase to describe these two different translation approaches. Dryden described metaphrase as a form of translating what he called word by word and line by line from one language into another, also known as a literal or word by word translation. Paraphrase, on the other hand, is a form of translation where, Dryden says, the author's words are not so strictly followed as his sense, also known as a free or sense-by-sense translation.
So metaphrase is word-by-word translation, sticking really close to the original, regardless of what the resulting translation sounds like. This is also called verbal translation. Paraphrase is sense-by-sense translation, staying close to the original, but creating a translation that sounds fluent. So it sounds like a piece of literature in the language into which it has been translated.
Dryden also introduced a third type of translation approach, that of imitation. In an imitation translation, a translator, quote, assumes the liberty not only to vary from the words and sense, but to forsake them both, or what might be called a creative translation. This type of translation is very much like creative writing, or the creation of new work inspired by the source text. Dryden was dismissive of both metaphrase and imitation, describing them as two extremes which ought to be avoided.
So if we asked Dryden for advice on how to translate, he would tell us, do not use metaphrase. Do not translate word by word. As he said, 'tis almost impossible to translate verbally and well at the same time. And he says something funny. He says, 'tis much like dancing on ropes with fettered legs. A man may shun a fall by using caution, but the gracefulness of motion is not to be expected. And what he means there is that if you have a tightrope artist, somebody dancing on a rope high in the air with legs that are tied, perhaps this dancer on the rope can stop him or herself from falling, but it won't be elegant. It won't be an attractive, elegant, graceful piece of work. And that's what he's saying about translation that is done as a metaphrase, that it is like dancing with tied legs.
So how can you tell if a translation is using a word-by-word approach versus a sense-by-sense translation approach? One way is simply to pay attention to how the translation sounds in its target language. If it sounds clunky or awkward with unusual syntax and confusing phrases, those may be clues that what you're reading is a word-by-word or literal translation. If, on the other hand, a translation uses familiar language and recognizable expressions and phrases, it's likely the translator is using sense by sense or free translation to convey the meaning of the text, rather than focusing on the definition and placement of the individual words themselves. Take this poem by 8th century Chinese poet Wang Wei, for example. On the left, we have the source text. On the right, we have what is called a translator's crib, or a document with close lexical definitions for each word or character of the poem. Cribs are a basic form of word-for-word translation and are sometimes used by translators as a reference point when translating a source text. First, let's hear the poem in the source language. If you don't know Chinese, you can follow along a little using the crib.
鹿柴，王维。空山不见人，但闻人语响。返景入深林，复照青苔上。
Next, we'll listen to 3 different translations of the poem: a metaphrase, a paraphrase, and an imitation translation.
Deer thicket. Empty mountain, one sees no people, yet one hears people's voice sound. Reflected sunlight enters the deep forest, again shines luscious moss. Deer fence. Empty hills, no one in sight, only the sound of someone talking. Late sunlight enters the deep wood, shining over the green moss again. Where the deer sleep. In all these hills is no man's dwelling, whence should an echo of voices come? A wary whisper, there is no telling. In these lone hills is no man's dwelling. There's no wind or the tree tops swelling, the low sunset breeze is dumb. And in all these hills is no man's dwelling, whence should a ghost of voices come?
As you can see, these are very different versions of the same poem. The metaphrase or word-for-word translation reads as clunky and awkward, whereas the paraphrase or sense-for-sense translation reads as more fluid and legible. On the other hand, the imitation translation embellishes the poem in such a way that makes it almost unrecognizable, erasing the stoic simplicity of the source text. These differences draw attention to one important truth about translation. There is no one correct way to translate a text.